She heard her name through a closed door, and that was how she learned what she was worth. Not much, as it turned out, not to the man on the other side of that door. But we'll get to that. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're listening from. I want to see how far this one travels. The door was oak thick and dark, the kind her Uncle Hector had specifically chosen because it muffled sound from his study. He'd told her that, once proud of it, the way he was proud of everything in that house that spoke of permanence and weight. Hector Voss was a man who believed that solid things inspired respect. He hadn't counted on the fact that if you pressed your back against solid oak and held your breath, you could still make out words. Not all of them, but enough. Nora stood in the hallway of her uncle's St. Louis townhouse on a Tuesday morning in March of 1878, her hand resting against the doorframe, and she listened. Two voices inside, Hector's low and deliberate, and another she didn't recognize, clipped businesslike, the voice of a man accustomed to transactions. She caught her name first, then the word maps, then a number that made her stomach drop. Then Hector's voice, almost amused. "She doesn't know anything. Let her go. She only needs to be there long enough to get those survey documents." The other man said something she couldn't hear. "She'll do what she's told," Hector said. "She always has." Nora lifted her hand from the doorframe. She stood in the hallway for a long moment, listening to the silence of a house that had never felt like home. Then she walked to the kitchen, poured herself a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and sat down at the small table by the window. She didn't understand all of it yet, but she understood enough. She said yes when Hector called her into the study an hour later. She kept the letter she found that night, and she got on the train to Wyoming 6 days after that. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The morning Hector summoned her began like most mornings in that house, with the sound of his footsteps overhead, precise and deliberate, moving from bedroom to washroom to the top of the stairs. Nora was already up. She was always already up. Sleep had been difficult for 3 years, and she'd long since stopped fighting it. She rose before dawn, made coffee, sat with whatever legal document or accounting ledger she could find, and let the work crowd out the other things. She was reviewing a property deed when Hector appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was dressed for business. Dark coat, silver watch chain hair, combed back with the particular severity he reserved for important days. He looked at her over the rim of his glasses, the way he always looked at her, as though she were a problem he hadn't yet found the right solution for. "My study, 15 minutes. He didn't wait for an answer. The study smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper, and the specific mustiness of a room where important men made decisions about other people's lives. Hector sat behind his desk. Nora sat in the chair across from it, the one with the slightly uneven leg that wobbled if you shifted your weight, which she suspected was not an accident. He folded his hands on the desk. He looked at her with something that might in different circumstances have passed for paternal concern. "I have good news," he said. Nora waited. "I've arranged a marriage for you." The clock on the mantel ticked. Somewhere outside, a horse cart rattled over cobblestones. Nora kept her expression neutral, a skill she'd been practicing since she was 17, and learned that showing Hector anything he could use was a mistake. "A marriage," she repeated. "His name is Eli Crane. He's a surveyor, works for the Federal Land Office based out of Wyoming Territory." Hector opened a folder on his desk and slid a single sheet of paper toward her. 34 years old, owns a supply station and a considerable tract of land. Financially stable, well regarded by the Bureau. Nora looked at the paper without touching it. A name, a profession, a location, nothing that answered the question she actually had. Why? Hector's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Because you're 24 years old, Nora. Because your father's estate left nothing but debts. Because your options in this city are considerably more limited than they were 3 years ago." A pause. "And because Mr. Crane has asked specifically for you." That last part was the one that didn't fit. She turned it over in her mind while Hector continued explaining something about the arrangement being mutually beneficial, about Wyoming being a land of opportunity, about how a woman with her particular set of skills would find more use for them out west than clerking in a city that had already decided what to make of her. She heard the words. She was cataloging them the way she cataloged everything, filing each one away for later examination. "He's never met me," she said. "He's aware of your work. The legal summaries you prepared for your father's firm came across his desk through a mutual contact." Hector leaned back. He found them impressive. Nora looked at the paper again. This time she picked it up. The handwriting on the letter attached was different from the typed summary, smaller, more precise. The kind of handwriting that belonged to someone who was accustomed to writing in difficult conditions. Field conditions. She set it back down. "When 3 weeks. I've already written to confirm the arrangement." So the decision had already been made. Of course it had. She was a problem in need of a solution, and Hector had never been the kind of man to consult the problem before solving it. She thought about the voice through the oak door that morning. She only needs to be there long enough. "All right," she said. Hector blinked. He'd expected more resistance. She could see it in the slight relaxing of his jaw. "You agree?" I said all right. She stood, smoothed her skirt, and moved toward the door. "I'll need to know what to pack for that climate." She didn't look back at his expression. But she felt it on the back of her neck, all the way down the hall. That night she went through his desk. She wasn't proud of it. She told herself she was being practical, that what she'd heard through the door that morning required verification that a woman in her position couldn't afford to move across the country on the basis of half a conversation and a bad feeling. She also knew that if she examined that reasoning too closely, it might not hold. Hector dined at his club on Tuesday evenings and didn't return until after 10. She had 2 hours. The desk was locked, but the lock was old, and she'd watched her father open similar ones with a letter knife a dozen times before she understood what it meant that she'd been watching. She found the folder third drawer down beneath a ledger that didn't quite match the household accounts. The correspondence inside was businesslike and damning in equal measure. Letters to a company called Meridian Railway Development. References to survey data not yet filed with the Bureau. References to land parcels in Wyoming Territory that had not yet been officially mapped, which meant they had not yet been officially claimed, which meant that whoever held those maps first held everything. Eli Crane's name appeared 4 times. Survey rights, access, documents not yet submitted for federal review, and then in Hector's handwriting on a draft letter near the bottom of the stack, "The girl can be an asset here. She's observant, and she's trusted no one for 3 years. She won't ask questions she doesn't already know the answers to, and she won't share what she finds. I'll make sure she understands the terms before she leaves." Nora read that last line twice. She'd been wrong earlier. It wasn't that he'd arranged her marriage without consulting her. It was that he'd arranged it as a transaction and forgotten to mention what currency she was. She put the folder back exactly as she'd found it. She re-locked the desk. She went to her room, sat on the edge of the bed, and looked at the wall. She thought about leaving, going somewhere he couldn't reach, east-south somewhere, with a different name and a different story. She had almost no money, no family that wasn't tangled up in his, no reputation that hadn't been quietly corroded by 3 years of association with a household in decline. She thought about Edmund Carr. That thought, as it always did, closed off the other options like a door swinging shut. She stood up, lit the candle on her desk, pulled out a sheet of paper, and began to write, not a letter, not a plan, just a list. Everything she knew, everything she suspected, everything she would need to survive what was coming. She wrote until the candle burned low. Then she folded the list, put it in the bottom of her traveling bag, and lay down on top of the covers with her boots still on. She didn't sleep, but by the time gray light started coming through the curtains, she knew 2 things. Hector thought he was sending a tool to Wyoming. He was actually sending someone who'd read his correspondence, memorized his contacts, and had nothing left to lose. She left on a Thursday in early April. In Fuotaeds, Hector saw her to the station with the particular brand of warmth he deployed in public, a hand on her elbow, a few words about writing when she arrived, the performance of an uncle who was doing his best by a difficult niece. The porter who loaded her single trunk didn't know he was watching a transaction. He just tipped his hat and moved on. The train pulled out of St. Louis at 8:30. Nora sat by the window and watched the city unravel the dense brick buildings, giving way to the looser sprawl of the outskirts, then to flat farmland, then to something wider and emptier that didn't have a name she knew. She had a book in her bag that she didn't open. She had the list she'd made the night of Hector's desk folded small in her coat pocket, which she touched every hour or so the way other people touched rosaries. She had the letter at the bottom of her trunk, the one she'd carried for 3 years without showing anyone. The land outside the window kept changing, and she kept watching it. By the second day, the farms were fewer and the sky was larger. She hadn't understood before this what people meant when they talked about western sky, how it started to feel less like a ceiling and more like a fact, something that existed independently of the ground beneath it taking up its own portion of the world. In St. Louis, the sky was something you saw between buildings. Out here, it was simply present, enormous, and indifferent and oddly settling. At a stop in Kansas, she got off to stretch her legs and stood on the platform breathing air that smelled like dry grass and cold and something faintly mineral she couldn't identify. An older woman in a gray traveling coat stopped beside her. "First time out west. Is it that obvious?" The woman smiled. "You're looking at everything. People who've been here before stop looking." She nodded toward the horizon. "Where are you headed?" "Wyoming Territory, a place called Crane Station." The woman's expression shifted not alarm, but a kind of assessment. "That's high country. You have family there." "A husband," Nora said. The word felt strange in her mouth, hypothetical. "Nearly." "Nearly," the woman repeated. She seemed to find this satisfactory. "Well, Wyoming has a way of making things clear. Good luck to you." She walked back to the train. Nora stood on the platform a moment longer looking at the sky. Then she got back on. The train ended at Cheyenne. From there, she hired a seat on a supply wagon, heading northwest 3 days through terrain that grew progressively less negotiable, the road becoming a track, becoming a suggestion. The driver, a taciturn man named Briggs, answered her questions about the geography with single words and occasional grunts that she learned to interpret as a partial vocabulary. The rocky outcropping to the east was called the Teeth. The river they crossed twice was called the Gray Sister. The valley they dropped into on the afternoon of the second day, wide and green between 2 ridges of dark stone, didn't have a name he knew. "People just call it the valley," he said. "That seems insufficient." He looked at her sideways. "Most things out here are." She rode the last 8 miles on horseback, a bay mare that Briggs arranged at the last settlement, steady and practical, and not interested in Nora's opinions about the saddle. The terrain climbed. The air thinned and went cold, even in the April afternoon, carrying the smell of pine resin and snowmelt, and something clean she still didn't have a name for, but was beginning to recognize. She saw the station before she reached it, a cluster of low buildings in a natural hollow where 2 ridges met smoke from 2 chimneys, a corral with horses moving slow in the late light. Larger than she'd expected, more permanent. She'd imagined something makeshift, temporary, the kind of outpost that existed because nothing better had arrived yet. This looked like someone had decided to stay. She pulled the mare to a stop on the rise above it and looked down. The mountains behind the station caught the last of the sun on their upper faces, granite and snow and shadow in layers going up until they stopped making sense at the scale she was accustomed to. She'd never seen anything like them. She'd read about the Rockies. She'd seen illustrations. Neither of those things had communicated what it felt like to be small in front of something that large, not frightened exactly, but recalibrated. Reminded that the categories she'd been using to measure things weren't the only ones available. She touched the list in her coat pocket. Then she rode down. The man who came out of the main building as she dismounted was not what she'd been preparing for. She had constructed a version of Eli Crane on the journey, assembled him from the spare facts Hector had given her and the tone of the correspondence she'd read. She'd expected someone older looking harder, the kind of man who dealt in land and surveys and federal bureaucracy, because he understood that the world was a transaction and had simply decided to be good at transactions. The man walking toward her across the packed dirt of the station yard was none of that. He was tall and broad-shouldered in the way of someone who worked outdoors in all weather, not built for appearance, but for use. The kind of physical capability that came from years of carrying equipment up mountains and sleeping on rock. Dark hair gone slightly too long. A face with the particular weathering of someone who spent most of his time at elevation, where the sun was closer and the wind had opinions. A scar along his jaw, old and well-healed. His hands, when she noticed them, were the hands of a man who worked with them, calloused and ink-stained in equal measure, which she found unexpectedly interesting. He stopped a few feet from her horse and looked at her. Not the way men usually looked at women they were meeting for the first time, that quick inventory, that assessment of features against a checklist. He looked at her the way someone looks at a problem they've been thinking about for a long time and are finally seeing in 3 dimensions. "Nora Voss," he said. His voice was quieter than she'd expected. Measured. "Mr. Crane. Eli." He didn't offer his hand immediately. "How was the ride up from the valley?" "Long," she said. "The mayor has a strong opinion about pace." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. "That's Juniper. She's right about pace. Come inside." He turned without waiting to see if she'd follow. She followed. The inside of the station was nothing like Hector's study, and everything like the landscape outside, built for function, built to last. Built by someone who understood that in this country, the difference between a structure that stood and one that didn't was not aesthetics, but attention. The main room ran the full width of the building. A stone hearth at the far end large enough to heat the space adequately and cook in if necessary. Plank floors worn smooth and dark with use. A long table of rough-hewn timber that could seat 12 currently set for 2. Shelves along the east wall held a combination of supplies, canned goods, rope medical equipment, and books. A quantity of books that surprised her, their spines cracked and pages swollen from altitude and use. A door to the left led to what appeared to be a workroom. Through it, she could see a drafting table covered in paper, several rolled maps in a standing rack, and the particular organized chaos of someone who worked with precision but not tidiness. A door to the right was closed. Eli moved to the stove without ceremony and lifted the lid on a pot that had been sitting low. The smell that came from it was savory and complex venison, she thought, and something herbed. "Sit," he said. "I'm fine. You've been on horseback for 8 miles at altitude after 3 days on a wagon." He didn't look up from the stove. "You're not fine. You're tired, and your legs hurt, and you haven't eaten since this morning." "Sit." Nora sat. She watched him move around the kitchen end of the room with the economy of someone who'd been feeding himself in remote locations for a long time. No wasted motion, no performance of hospitality, just the practical work of getting food onto a surface where it could be consumed. He set a bowl in front of her, bread that was 2 days old but still substantial. Coffee black, poured from a pot that had been on the back of the stove. Then he sat across from her and waited. She picked up the spoon. The stew was better than it had any right to be. Given the circumstances, the herbs unfamiliar, the venison tender, the broth, carrying a depth that suggested someone who paid attention to what they were doing even when no one was watching. She ate slowly, refusing to let him see how hungry she was, and used the time to study the room. The books were the most interesting thing, not decorative, not curated for impression. Their arrangement on the shelves had the logic of someone who pulled them out and put them back frequently, organizing by use rather than appearance. She could see survey manuals beside novels, beside something that looked like a botanical field guide, beside what appeared to be a well-worn copy of Thoreau. She set down her spoon. "Why me?" He looked at her without surprise, as though he'd been waiting for the question and had decided not to rush it. "Direct," he said. "You've had 3 days to notice things about the room. I've had 30 seconds. I'd rather spend them on the question that matters." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. The ink stains on his fingers were blue-black and recent. "What do you already know?" "That you contacted my uncle. That the arrangement came from your side, not his, at least initially. That you'd seen work I'd done." She kept her voice level. "What I don't know is why that work was enough to make you write a marriage proposal to a man you'd never met about a woman you'd never met." Eli was quiet for a moment, outside. The wind moved through the pines, a sound she was already starting to recognize, lower and more continuous than city wind, like the landscape breathing. "4 years ago," he said, "I was part of a survey team working a disputed land claim in Nebraska. The case went to arbitration. The legal summary submitted for the Federal Review was the clearest piece of legal writing I've seen before or since it laid out a situation that had been deliberately complicated by 3 parties with competing interests. And it made it simple without making it wrong." He paused. "Your name was on it. You were 19th. Nora remembered that case. She'd spent 2 weeks on that summary, working from her father's notes, and 6 contradictory depositions, trying to find the line where truth lived inside the tangle of competing claims. Her father had submitted it under his own name. "My father's name was on it," she said. "His name was typed at the bottom. The handwriting in the margins was yours. The corrections in the second draft were yours. I know the difference between someone checking work and someone doing it." He met her eyes. "I asked about you through the contact who handled the arbitration. By the time I had enough information to act on, your father had died, and you were living in your uncle's house." Nora absorbed this, the careful research of it, the patience. "You could have written to me directly," she said. "Would you have answered?" She thought about the 3 years in Hector's house, the narrowing of options, the way she'd become incrementally someone who moved carefully through spaces that didn't belong to her, making herself small enough not to be noticed and useful enough not to be discarded. "Probably not," she admitted. Eli nodded once as though this confirmed something. "I wrote to your uncle because that was the door that opened. I didn't know what he was." A pause, almost imperceptible. "I know more now." The fire in the hearth shifted and settled. Nora looked at him, really looked the way she hadn't allowed herself to do since she arrived. The careful inventory she usually performed on people she needed to understand. His expression was patient without being passive. There was something behind it that she recognized, the way you recognize a language you once knew and have been trying not to speak, a quality of attention that came from spending large amounts of time alone in places that required you to pay attention to survive. "You said you know more now," she said, "about my uncle. I've had concerns for a few months, the way certain information has been moving." He chose his words carefully. "I'm not going to ask you what you know about that. Not tonight." "Why not?" "Because you just spent 6 days traveling to a place you've never been to, marry a person you've never met. And you're sitting at my table drinking cold coffee and asking entirely reasonable questions instead of falling apart." His voice was even. "Tonight, that's enough." Nora looked at her coffee cup. "Here's what I want to offer," Eli continued. 1 month. You stay, you learn about the work you learn about this place. At the end of that month, you decide. If you want to leave, I'll give you a horse and enough money to go wherever you want to go. and start over somewhere no one knows your name. And if I stay, then we figure out the rest together." Nora turned this over the way she turned over legal documents looking for the clause that changed the meaning the paragraph that contradicted the premise. She didn't find one. "You're not worried I'll take the horse and the money and disappear?" "I think if you were going to disappear, you would have done it in St. Louis." He stood, picked up the empty bowls. "Your room is at the top of the stairs. Door locks from the inside. There's a wash basin and extra blankets in the chest at the foot of the bed." He moved toward the kitchen. "Eli." He stopped. "Why did you say yes to my uncle's terms when you already had concerns about him, eh?" He turned back halfway. In the firelight, his expression was harder to read, but she caught something in it, not evasion, but the particular quality of an honest person choosing how much honesty to deploy at once. "Because I needed someone who could read legal terrain the way I read physical terrain," he said. "And because I thought you probably needed a way out." He paused. "I was hoping both things could be true at the same time." He went back to the kitchen. Nora sat at the table for a long time after that, listening to the sound of water and the wind in the pines and the fire settling into coals. Then she went upstairs. The room was small and cold and smelled of pine and something slightly metallic that she would later identify as the iron content of the local water. The bed was narrow, but the blankets were adequate. The window faced north toward the mountains, and when she stood at it, she could see their upper faces dark against a sky that had more stars in it than she'd known existed. She locked the door, not because she was afraid, though she noted with some surprise that she wasn't, but because privacy was something she hadn't had in 3 years, and the ability to lock a door from the inside felt like a fact about herself she'd almost forgotten. She didn't unpack her trunk that night, but she took the list out of her coat pocket and read it through once, then folded it and put it under the pillow. 1 month, she thought. She could survive anything for 1 month. She was asleep before she finished the thought. The next morning began with sound. Nora lay in the narrow bed and cataloged it before she opened her eyes. Hoofbeats in the yard, the distant metal ring of something being worked at a forge, voices moving past the window below, the particular creak of a building settling in cold air. More people than she'd expected, more activity. She'd thought of this place as a station in the way a train depot was a station, a point of transit, functional and impersonal. What she was hearing was something else. She dressed in the dark and went downstairs. The main room was already occupied. A woman she didn't recognize was setting the long table, middle-aged, compact, with gray-streaked red hair and the brisk competence of someone who had never once in her life done anything slowly when quickly was available. She looked up when Nora appeared on the stairs. "You're the surveyor's woman," she said. Not unkindly. "I'm Nora Voss. May Sutherland." The woman set down a stack of tin plates. "I run the trading post next door. We share the kitchen most mornings, too cold to heat 2 buildings before 8. She studied Nora with frank curiosity, the kind that didn't pretend to be anything else. "Coffee's on the stove. Eli's already out. Where he always is before breakfast, the ridge above the North Corral." May tilted her head toward the window. "Takes his first readings of the day when the light's right. You'll learn the schedule." Nora poured coffee and looked out the window. The yard was active, 2 men working on a wagon wheel, a boy leading horses to water a woman, hanging laundry on a line strung between 2 posts, moving efficiently in the cold air. Beyond the buildings, the land rose toward the ridge May had indicated, and she could see a figure up there, small against the sky, standing at something she couldn't quite make out. "How many people live here?" Nora asked. "At the station, counting Eli's crew, about a dozen year-round, another 8 or so nearby, who come in for supplies and sociability." May poured her own coffee and leaned against the counter. "This time of year, the survey teams start coming through, heading into the high country. Gets busier." "Who are Eli's crew?" May looked at her with an expression that was halfway between appreciation and assessment. You ask a lot of questions for someone who just arrived. I find questions more efficient than waiting. May seemed to arrive at a decision. Dade runs the forge, you'll have heard him already this morning. Came out from Virginia after the war, doesn't talk about it. Does good work. The Whitehorse family, John and Clara, and their 3. They have a place about a mile east, help with the horses and the trading. Clara knows more about the plants up here than anyone living. She paused. And then there's the survey crew proper, 2 men Eli's worked with for years, Pete and Aldous. They're up in the high country right now, won't be back for another week. What? Nora filed all of this. What do most people do here day to day? Survive, May said without irony. Trade. Help each other with what needs doing. She picked up the coffee pot and topped off both their cups. It's not like the city. Nobody asks where you came from or what you did before. They ask what you can do and whether you'll show up when it matters. Nora thought about St. Louis, where people asked exactly where you came from and what you did before, and where the answers were used primarily to calibrate how much of your difficulty they would be required to tolerate. I can read and write at a professional level, she said. I can manage accounts. I know basic land law and contract structure. I learn quickly. May looked at her for a long moment. Can you ride? Adequately. Can you shoot? I've never tried. Dade can fix that. May set down her cup and picked up a tray. Breakfast in 10 minutes. Go find Eli on the ridge. Tell him if he's late again, I'm giving his portion to the horses. She found him exactly where May had sat on the flat rock shelf above the north corral, standing behind a surveying instrument she recognized from illustrations, but had never seen in use, a theodolite, brass and glass and precise, mounted on a wooden tripod. He was looking through the eyepiece, making small adjustments, writing in a notebook, without taking his eye from the lens. She stopped a few feet away and waited. He wrote 3 more lines, then straightened and looked at her. May says your portion goes to the horses if you're late. May has been saying that for 2 years. He capped his pen. She always saves it anyway. The view from the ridge was different from the view through the station window, wider the valley visible to the south as a long green corridor between ridges, the mountains to the north closer and more defined in the early light. She could see the shapes that the shadows made, the way the topography read differently at different angles. What are you measuring? She asked. Angle of elevation on the northeast ridge. I take readings at the same points every few days during the melt season. The snowpack changes the apparent height, and I want the baseline measurements taken before it shifts. He began folding up the tripod. It's not required by the Bureau. And folding up the mow. I do it because understanding how the land changes is more useful than understanding how it looks at one moment. For the maps. For the maps. He handed her the notebook to hold while he worked on the tripod legs. Look at the last page. She opened it. The page held columns of numbers, elevation readings, degrees, times, and below them in smaller handwriting that ran along the bottom margin northeast face, holds the cold longest. Snow reads blue-gray at 6 a.m. white by 8. The rock underneath is darker than the valley stone. Different age, different story. She looked up. That's not survey data, she said. No. The Bureau doesn't need to know the snow reads blue-gray at 6 in the morning. The Bureau doesn't. He took the notebook back and tucked it under his arm. But it's true, and true, things should be written down. She stood on the ridge with the cold air coming off the mountains and the valley spreading south below her, and the sensation strange and almost uncomfortable of encountering a mind that worked along lines she recognized. She'd spent 3 years surrounded by people who wrote things down because they had to, or because they wanted a record that could be used. She had not met in those 3 years anyone who wrote things down because they were true and true things deserved to exist on paper. She didn't say any of that. Breakfast, she said. May's waiting. He picked up the tripod. What did you think of the room? Small. Yes, the view is good. He glanced at her sideways. "Better in winter. The deciduous trees lose their leaves, and you can see the full ridge line." "I may not be here in winter." "No," he agreed. "You may not." They walked back down to the station in the cold morning light, not talking, and Nora thought about blue-gray snow and true things written down in margins, and tried very hard not to read anything into it. The days that followed had a rhythm she hadn't anticipated. She'd expected the month to feel like an audit, a formal assessment of mutual suitability conducted at a careful distance. Instead, it folded her in before she'd decided to be folded. There was simply too much work for distance to be sustainable. In the mornings, she rode with Eli or sat with him at the drafting table, learning to read topographic lines, how contours compressed meant steep terrain, how they spread meant gentle slope, how a closed circle meant a summit, and the numbers inside it told you how high. It was a language, and like any language, it had its own logic that became with exposure increasingly intuitive. By the end of the first week, she could look at a section of map and tell him roughly what the ground would feel like underfoot without having walked it. "You're faster than I expected," he said one afternoon, not looking up from his own work. "You expected slow. I expected the learning curve to take longer. I've been reading legal documents since I was 15. Legal documents are also a language where the shape of the thing tells you as much as the content." She ran her finger along a contour line. "This is a river valley. The way the lines curve upstream." "Yes? What's it called?" "Not named yet. We're the first survey team to map this section." She looked at the blank space on the map where a name should be. Something about it struck her as both lonely and significant, a place that existed, that had rock and water and weather, that had existed long before anyone arrived with instruments to measure it, and yet had no word attached to it that could be passed between people. "How do you decide what to name things?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes by what they look like, sometimes by who found them, sometimes by what happened there." He paused. "Sometimes I can't decide, and I just leave them blank for a while. The right name usually comes." She looked at the blank space a moment longer. Then she went back to her contour lines. In the afternoons, she worked with May. This was not formally arranged. It evolved from the first morning when Nora, finding herself with an hour of unstructured time and no tolerance for unstructured time, had walked into the trading post and asked if there was anything that needed doing. May had looked at her for a long moment and then pointed at the accounts ledger, which had apparently been in a state of creative disorder for the better part of a season. Nora spent 3 afternoons untangling it. May, in exchange, taught her things: how to evaluate goods for trade, what a rancher actually needed versus what they said they needed, how to assess whether a man offering to barter labor was worth the labor he was offering, how to manage the particular diplomacy of a small community where everybody knew everybody's business and relationships were both the most important currency and the most fragile, how to read weather, coming off the mountains the way clouds built differently over granite than over the valley floor, the smell of the air before snow, how to load and fire the rifle that Dade had cleaned and adjusted and left on the trading post counter with a note that said, "For the surveyor's woman," in handwriting that suggested Dade had learned to write under considerable duress. She was not good at shooting at first. She was methodical about becoming good at it, which May said was better. She met Clara Whitehorse on the 6th day when Eli took her east along the valley floor to check on a survey marker that had been reported disturbed. Clara was in her garden, what served as a garden, a carefully tended rectangle of turned earth in a south-facing hollow where the growing season was a few weeks longer than everywhere else. She was a quiet woman with a directness that Nora recognized and respected, and she spoke to Nora without the particular careful neutrality that people adopted when they weren't sure how much trouble the newcomer was going to be. She showed Nora 3 plants and what they were good for. Then she showed her where the wild onions grew at the edge of the tree line, and the difference between the 2 varieties of them, one of which was edible and one of which would make you wish you were dead. "How do you remember all of it?" Nora asked. "I grew up knowing it." Clara wiped soil from her hands. "My mother knew it. Her mother knew it. The land teaches you if you pay attention long enough." "What if you haven't been paying attention long enough?" Clara looked at her. "Then you start today." On the way back, Eli said, "Clara doesn't talk much to most people. She talked to me." I noticed. Nora considered this. "Is that unusual?" "Moderately." He rode for a moment. "She told me once that she can tell within about 5 minutes whether someone is listening or just waiting to talk. She said most people wait." Boy, Nora thought about the 3 years in Hector's house, where listening was the only form of intelligence gathering available to her, where she had listened so carefully for so long that she sometimes forgot she was allowed to speak. "I've had a lot of practice listening," she said. Eli glanced at her sideways. "I know." She wanted to ask him what he meant by that. She didn't. 3 weeks in, she realized she'd stopped counting the days. It arrived as a physical sensation. She was in the trading post working on a supply order for a rancher named Gruber, who communicated primarily in grunts and approximate quantities, and she thought, Tuesday. It's Tuesday. And then she thought the third Tuesday. And then she had to actually work backward to confirm this, which meant she hadn't been keeping a running count, which meant something had happened to the part of her brain that had been measuring the time until she could leave. She put down Gruber's order and looked at the wall for a moment. May came in from the back. "You've gone still," May said. "You only go still when something surprises you." "I was counting." "Counting what?" "Days." Nora picked up the order again. "I'd stopped." May was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in the particular tone she used when she was about to say something she'd been sitting on for a while, "Can I ask you something? You're going to regardless. Are you happy here?" Nora set down the order a second time. She turned the question over the way she turned over documents, looking for the precise answer, the one that was true and also complete. "I don't know yet," she said finally. "I'm not unhappy. That's new." May nodded slowly. "It's a start. Are you going to tell me I should stay?" "I'm going to tell you that in 22 years of living in remote locations, I've met a lot of people passing through. Most of them were passing through because they were running from something." She moved behind the counter and began reorganizing a shelf with brisk efficiency. "You're running from something. I don't know what, and it's not my business. But I've also watched you these 3 weeks, and I'll tell you what I see." Nora waited. "I see someone who runs toward things faster than she runs from them. The work, the maps, Clara's garden, Dade's rifle lessons. You didn't do any of that because you had to. You did it because you wanted to know." May set a tin of tobacco squarely on the shelf. "That's not a woman who was made for somewhere else. That's a woman who hasn't found the right somewhere yet." Nora thought about St. Louis. The desk in Hector's house that wasn't hers, the chair with the uneven leg, the 3 years of making herself small and useful and unthreatening. The particular exhaustion of performing irrelevance as a survival strategy. She thought about the map with the blank space where a name should be. "Don't tell Eli I said that," May said. "He's insufferably patient as it is. He doesn't need encouragement." The flood came without much warning, which Eli later said was typical of the high country in April. There were signs if you knew to read them. The night before, the temperature had dropped sharply and then risen again too fast, the kind of reversal that meant the snowpack at elevation was destabilizing. The creek that ran behind the station had been running high all week from the gradual melt, and by morning it had a sound to it that was different from the sound it usually had. Lower and more urgent, like something making up its mind. Eli noticed it at breakfast. "The Sutton marker," he said, setting down his coffee. "I need to check it before the melt accelerates. It's in a drainage basin. If the water rises fast enough, it could take out the stake and the reference point with it." "I'll come," Nora said. He looked at her. "It's a 2-hour ride. The terrain gets rough in the last mile." "I know. I've been out that way with Pete." Pete had returned from the high country the previous week, a compact, cheerful man with sun-damaged skin and a talent for navigating difficult ground. He'd taken her on 3 rides into the surrounding terrain, introducing her to the landscape the way Eli introduced her to maps, not by telling her what things were, but by letting her observe until she asked. Eli picked up his coffee again. "Bring the wool coat, not the riding jacket." They left at 7. The ride was as rough as he'd indicated. In the last mile, the trail narrowing to a track through dense pine, and then opening onto a series of rocky shelves above a drainage basin that collected runoff from 3 separate ridges. The survey marker, a brass stake set in a rock cairn, was exactly where it should be. And the drainage basin was exactly as concerning as Eli had predicted. The water was moving fast and brown with sediment already several inches above its normal channel. "How long do we have?" Nora asked. Eli studied the water for a moment. He had a way of looking at terrain that she'd come to recognize, not the quick scan of someone taking inventory, but the slower attention of someone reading. 2 hours at current rate, possibly less if it picks up. He began unpacking his equipment. "I need to take reference measurements before the stake is compromised. Give me 40 minutes. She held the horses while he worked, watching the water. It was rising visibly, not dramatically, not in the sudden surge of a flash flood, but steadily, inexorably, the way serious things often came, not as an event, but as an accumulation. She heard it before she saw it. A sound from upslope, a deep resonant crack, like something fundamental giving way. Then a roar that built fast. And then the water came. Not a wall exactly, more like the creek, deciding all at once to become something larger than a creek. The drainage basin filled in under 2 minutes, brown water churning and carrying debris branches, soil the remnants of a dead pine that had been standing at the basin edge. The survey marker disappeared. Eli grabbed his equipment and moved upslope in the same motion. And Nora pulled the horses back from the edge and held them while they shied and stamped against the noise. When the initial surge passed and the water settled into its new higher level, they stood on the rock shelf above it and looked at what had changed. The trail back was gone. Not washed out entirely. The rock shelf was still there, but the lower section where the track crossed the drainage twice was now under 3 feet of moving water. Passable on foot in good conditions, possibly. Not on horseback, not safely, not with the water still rising. "How long will it take to subside?" Nora asked. Eli looked at the sky, at the ridgelines at the water. "If it holds at this level, 12 hours. If the melt continues overnight, longer." He looked at the horses. "We can't take them through that. Is there another way back, around the North Ridge, 8 miles instead of 2, and the last section is rough going even in dry conditions?" He looked at the sky again, calculating. "We'd make it back by dark if we left now and pushed hard." Nora looked at the horses. The bay mare, Juniper, was still nervous ears, flat weight shifting. The gelding Eli had ridden was calmer, but tired from the morning's terrain. "If we push them hard in this condition on that terrain," she said, "one of them will put a foot wrong." A silence. "Yes," Eli said, "so we wait." Another silence, longer. He was running calculations. She could see him running supply situation. Whether the risk to the horses weighed against the risk of a night in the open at this elevation in April. "There's an equipment cache about a 1/4 mile up the east shelf," he said finally. "Dry storage, enough room for 2 people, and the horses out of wind. Blankets, emergency rations." He looked at her with the particular expression she'd come to associate with him, offering her choices he didn't have to offer. "I can try the north route alone and send someone back." "Don't be absurd," Nora said. "Show me the cache." It was more substantial than the word cache suggested, a low stone structure built into the rock shelf, roofed with timber and sod, the door a heavy wooden panel that opened on iron hinges. Inside, 2 folded canvas bedrolls, a tin box of emergency rations, a lamp and oil rope. and the professional detritus of survey work, extra stakes, replacement instruments. Notebooks in a waterproof wrap. They brought the horses inside out of the wind and tied them at the far end. The structure was long enough to accommodate them without crowding. Eli lit the lamp. The small space filled with pale gold light, and the smell of horses and cold stone and the oil. Nora sat on one of the bedrolls and unwrapped the emergency rations while Eli checked the horses. The rations were not inspiring hardtack dried meat, a tin of something preserved that turned out on investigation to be peaches. But she was hungry, and the peaches were sweet in a way that felt almost extravagant given the circumstances. "Peaches," she said. Eli turned from the horses. "I put them there last fall, for morale." "Whose morale?" "Anyone who ended up needing the cash." He sat on the other bedroll. "It's happened before. Not the flooding usually, it's weather. The mountains don't give you much warning." "Does it bother you, being at the mercy of the terrain?" He considered this. "I'm not sure mercy is the right frame. The terrain isn't making decisions about me. It's just doing what it does." He took a piece of hardtack. "What bothers me is when I misread it. When I think I understand what it's going to do, and I'm wrong." "What do you do when that happens?" "Update the map." He said it simply without drama. If the terrain doesn't match the map is wrong. The terrain is always right. Nora thought about this for a while. Outside, the wind had picked up, moving against the stone walls with a low, continuous sound. The horses shifted and settled. The lamp held steady. "Your wife," she said. "Did she come to the cache sites?" She felt him go still in the particular way he went still when something landed closer than expected. Not flinching, recalibrating. "Not this one, Tush," he said. "She was here for 2 years. She learned the work well enough to help with the lower elevation surveys." A pause. She didn't like the high country. The altitude, the isolation, the way you could be a week from the nearest town and not know it because the terrain made everything look close together. He turned the hardtack over in his hands. She wasn't wrong to dislike it. I want to be clear about that. It's genuinely difficult. The winters especially. But you stayed. I couldn't not stay. He said it with a kind of helpless honesty. It would have been like asking me to stop doing the work. The work is here. This terrain, this specific country, the maps that don't exist yet, it's here. He paused. She went back east. We were honest with each other about why, which I suppose is the best you can do. Nora looked at the lamp flame. "Do you regret it staying?" "I regret that it hurt her." His voice was quiet. "I don't regret the staying. I regret not understanding sooner that wanting someone and needing someone who wants what you want are two different things." She turned this over. It was the kind of statement that bore examination from several angles. "Is that why you looked for someone who'd already demonstrated she could work with complexity?" she said. "Not just someone who was willing to try it." He looked at her. "Yes. That's either very rational or very cold." "I've been told both." He didn't sound defensive. "I think it's honest. I could have written to any number of women who might have been willing to come out here and see if they liked it. I didn't want willing. I wanted someone for whom this—" He gestured at the stone walls, the lamp, the horses. The sound of water outside was already the shape of their thinking, even if they didn't know it yet. Nora was quiet for a long time. She was aware of the small space between them, aware of the particular quality of the silence, not the silence of two strangers enduring proximity, but something with more texture to it, more internal weather. She thought about the list in her coat pocket. She thought about Edmund Carr. She thought about the things she hadn't told him, the things she'd been carrying for 3 years. The weight of it constant and familiar and present in this small stone room as it was everywhere else she went. She almost said it. The words were there. "I need to tell you something. I have to tell you something before this goes any further, and she could feel the shape of the moment, the particular quality of the firelight, and the closed space and his honesty preceding hers, and she opened her mouth. Then the horse nearest her shifted and stamped, and the moment shifted with it. And she heard herself say, "How long have you been mapping this territory?" If he noticed the change, the small gear shift of a conversation redirected, he didn't show it. He answered. They talked about the maps, about the Bureau, about the politics of land designation in a territory where official surveys and unofficial settlements had been running parallel and sometimes contradictory for 20 years. They talked until the lamp needed refilling, and they refilled it. They talked until the rations were gone, and they were both leaning against the stone wall with the horses breathing slow behind them. On the second night, the silence between them stopped feeling like distance and started feeling like something else entirely. She noticed it in the way you notice a change in air pressure, not as a specific event, but as a shift in the quality of the atmosphere, something settling into a new arrangement. They weren't talking. Eli was making notes by lamplight, adding observations about the flood's behavior to the notebook he seemed to carry with him always. Nora was reading one of the survey manuals she'd pulled from the waterproof wrap, working through a section on triangulation that she'd been meaning to tackle for a week. She looked up at some point and found him looking at her. Not the assessing look from the first evening, not the particular watchful attention she'd noticed in him when he was learning something new. Just looking the way someone looks when they're not thinking about how they're looking. She looked back for a moment. Then they both went back to their respective pages, and neither of them said anything, and outside the water moved through the dark, and the mountains held their cold. On the morning of the third day, the water had subsided enough that the lower crossing was passable. Eli packed the equipment in silence, efficient and careful. Nora rolled the bedrolls and secured the lamp and checked the horses. When everything was ready, she went to the door of the cache and looked out at the changed landscape, the drainage basin still running high, but controlled now. The terrain rearranged in small ways by the water's passage, unfamiliar and familiar at the same time. Eli came to stand beside her. "The Sutton marker is gone," he said. "You'll reset it." "Yes." He was looking at the basin, at the way the water had moved the soil at the edges, the new shape of the banks. "I'll have to update 3 sections of the map. The channel moved about 4 feet east." He was quiet for a moment. Then he took out the notebook and turned to the page he'd been adding to the night before, held it so she could see. At the top of the page, in his smaller handwriting, Sutton Basin, April 1878, flood event channel displacement approximately 4 feet east. Water held 3 days. And below the technical notes in the margin, N. Voss, present. First flood. Handled it better than the horses. She read it twice. "You put people in your field notes," she said, "when it seems relevant." "Does it seem relevant?" He looked at her. "It seemed like something that should be written down." She looked back at the drainage basin, at the new shape of the water, at the terrain that had rearranged itself and was already simply the way things were now. Her throat felt tight in a way she didn't entirely understand. She hadn't said yes yet. She was aware of that. She hadn't given him the answer he was waiting for, hadn't committed to staying. Hadn't told him the thing she needed to tell him before any of it could be real. But somewhere in 3 days of floodwater and lamplight and peaches and the particular honesty of a man who updated his maps when the terrain corrected him, she had stopped looking for a reason to say no. She was looking for something else now. She wasn't entirely sure she had it yet, but she knew what it was. "We should get back," she said. "May will have opinions about how long we've been gone." May always has opinions. They're usually right. He almost smiled. Usually. They mounted and rode back through the changed terrain, the horses picking their way carefully over ground that smelled of cold water and disturbed earth. And Nora thought about maps and what it meant to update them when the truth required it, and tried to figure out how you told someone the truth about yourself when the truth was the one thing that might change the map entirely. She had 6 days to figure it out. She didn't figure it out. Instead, she had the conversation with May about not being unhappy. She helped Dade repair a section of the corral fence that the flood had weakened. She sat with Clara Whitehorse for an afternoon and learned to identify 3 more plants and their uses. She went over the supply accounts with May and found a discrepancy that turned out to be an arithmetic error from 6 months ago and took her an hour to trace and correct, which was the most satisfying hour she'd spent in recent memory. And on the 25th evening of her 1 month, Eli came to the door of her room. She was at the small desk by the window working on a survey notation she'd volunteered to transcribe. The knock was his knock, 3 times measured waiting. She opened the door. He was holding something wrapped in cloth. He held it out without preamble. "I had Dade make something for you." She took it, unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a compass, not the standard-issue brass instrument of the survey kit, but something smaller, more precise, with a case of dark wood that fit her hand exactly. Her initials were inlaid on the lid in a lighter wood, small and clean. She opened it. The needle swung and settled north with the particular authority of a well-made instrument. "Every person who works the survey carries a compass," Eli said. "For navigation, for orientation, for knowing where you are when the terrain is unfamiliar." A pause. "I figured if you're going to be here, you should have one that fits." Nora looked at the compass, at her initials on the lid, at the needle pointing north with complete indifference to the complicated feelings of the person holding it. "Eli," she said, "it doesn't mean you have to stay. It just means, I know what it means." She looked up. "It means while I'm here, I'm not a guest." He met her eyes. "Yes." She held the compass in both hands. The wood was warm from wherever he'd been keeping it, already body temperature, as though it had been waiting to be held for some time. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, "before I give you an answer, before anything else." He didn't move, didn't prompt her. Just waited in the way he did everything with the full weight of his attention and no pressure attached to it. 3 years ago," she said, "there was a man named Edmund Carbar." She told him. All of it, her father's debts, the creditor who'd come to the house, the quiet and terrible transaction that had been arranged with her as the instrument. The courtroom. The words she'd said under oath that were not true, that she had known were not true. That she had said anyway because she was 21 years old and alone and frightened in a way she hadn't understood how to fight. Edmund Carr's face when the verdict came. The way he'd looked at her across the courtroom, not with anger, which she could have survived, but with something worse. Comprehension. She told him about the 3 years since. The way she'd carried it. The way it had made her unable to trust her own right to be anywhere, to belong to anything, because what right did she have to belong when she'd taken that right from someone else? She told him about Hector's folder, about what she'd understood when she read it. When she finished, the room was very quiet. The wind had died down outside, and she could hear the horses in the corral and the distant sound of Dade's forge banked for the night, the last of the heat ticking in the metal. Eli was looking at the floor. She couldn't read his expression from this angle. "Say something," she said. He looked up. His face was not what she'd expected. Not closed, not the careful neutrality of someone reconsidering. Something more complicated than that. Something that looked, which she found disorienting, like recognition. "My father," he said, "had a ranch hand who worked for him for 6 years. Good worker, honest from what I could see. My father accused him of theft a missing cash box and had him removed from the territory. No evidence, no trial, just my father's word against a man who had no standing to contradict it." He paused. "I was 17. I knew my father was lying. I didn't say anything." A silence. "That's not the same," Nora said. No, but I understand what it is to carry something you did wrong when you were too young and too frightened to do right, and to let it tell you that you don't deserve the things that come after. He held her gaze. You were 21. You were alone. You were threatened. That doesn't make it right. But it's not the whole story of who you are. Edmund Carr lost everything. I know. His voice was quiet. What are you going to do about that? She hadn't thought about it in those terms before, not as a question with an answer, as a condition, something to be endured and contained, not addressed. I don't know, she said. Find him, maybe. If he's findable, tell him. She paused. I don't think telling him changes what happened, but I think I owe him the truth at minimum. Yes, Eli said. You do. Not a judgment. Not absolution, just agreement. She looked at the compass in her hands, the needle still pointing north untroubled. You're not going to tell me it doesn't matter, she said. No, or that you forgive me on his behalf. No, that's not mine to give. He was quiet for a moment. But I'll tell you what I think. I think you came here carrying something that's been making you live like a tenant in your own life. And I think you've spent the last month proving that the person you are is not reducible to the worst thing you've done. He paused. That's not nothing, Nora. She looked at him for a long time, at his face in the lamplight, patient and unguarded, and exactly what it was. Ask me in the morning, she said. Something in his expression shifted the almost smile she'd seen on the ridge that first day present, and then not like light on water. Good night, he said. Good night. She closed the door and leaned against it, compass in hand, needle pointing north, and stood there in the dark of the room that smelled of pine and iron water until her breathing slowed. In the morning she went down to breakfast and sat across from him and said, Yes? He looked up from his coffee. Yes, she said again. I'm staying. He nodded once the way he nodded when something confirmed what he'd been thinking. Then he pushed the coffee pot toward her. There's a section of the upper valley that needs remapping after the flood, he said. I'd like you to come. I know, she said. I already packed the compass. Hector arrived on a Thursday in late May, which was how Nora knew it was serious. Hector did not travel on Thursdays. He had a system for everything correspondence on Mondays meetings, on Tuesdays and Wednesdays accounts on Fridays. Thursday was reserved for what he called maintenance, by which he meant the quiet management of things he didn't want on any official record. The fact that he'd disrupted his own system meant something had gone wrong with his timeline. She saw the horses before she recognized the riders. 3 of them coming up the valley road from the south in the mid-morning light, moving at a pace that was deliberately unhurried, the pace of men who wanted to be seen arriving rather than seen rushing. The 2 flanking Hector wore the city clothes that were wrong for the terrain good coats that hadn't been broken in for riding. Eastern money. Company men. Nora was on the trading post porch helping May inventory the spring supply order when she saw them. She set down the ledger without making a sound. You know those men, May asked. The one in the middle is my uncle. May looked at them. Then she looked at Nora. Do you want me to? No. Nora picked up the ledger again. Keep working. Let him come to me. He did. He crossed the yard with the particular walk of a man who believed that unhurried movement communicated authority. And he climbed the porch steps and looked at her with an expression of warm concern that was assembled from smaller, colder components. Nora. He leaned in to kiss her cheek. She allowed it. You look well. The mountain air agrees with you. Hector. She set the ledger on the porch rail. This is May Sutherland. She runs the trading post. May gave him a look of completely neutral assessment. Mr. Voss. Mrs. Sutherland. He turned back to Nora. A word, privately if you don't mind. I do mind, actually. May is in the middle of an inventory, and I'm helping her. Whatever you need to say it here or wait. Something flickered behind his eyes. He was recalibrating if the niece he'd sent north was not identical to the niece he was encountering on this porch. He absorbed the difference without showing it, which was the thing about Hector that had always made him dangerous. He was very good at not showing things. Very well. He folded his hands. I've come to check on the arrangements. Ensure everything is proceeding smoothly. Everything is proceeding smoothly. And the professional aspects Mr. Crane's work. You've been able to learn the routines. He was asking about the maps. He was asking it through 6 layers of plausible deniability, which meant he wasn't certain how much she knew, which meant he was here because his timeline was slipping and he needed to accelerate. I've learned the work very well, she said pleasantly. It's more technical than I expected. There's a great deal of notation involved. Of course. He smiled. I wonder if we might discuss the family situation. Your adjustment here, perhaps over dinner this evening. We eat communally at the station. You're welcome to join us. I was thinking something more. Communal dinner or nothing, Hector. A pause. The 2 company men behind him were pretending to be interested in the corral. Of course, he said again. Communal dinner. Eli was back from the Upper Valley survey by late afternoon. Nora found him at the drafting table and closed the workroom door behind her. My uncle is here, she said. 2 men with him. Company men Meridian Railway, I think based on the quality of their coats. Eli set down his pen. He didn't look surprised. When did you know he was coming? I didn't, but I knew he would eventually. She sat in the chair across from the drafting table. He asked about your work, the routines he called it. He's on a timeline, and something's gone wrong with it. The Bureau review was moved up, Eli said, 3 weeks earlier than originally scheduled. The commissioner wants the Wyoming Territory survey submitted by end of June rather than mid-July. He looked at her steadily. Someone with access to the Bureau's internal schedule would know that, which means the window for acquiring survey data before official filing has shortened significantly. Nora looked at the maps on the drafting table. The careful lines of the Upper Valley survey still incomplete the notations in Eli's hand along the margins. 3 months of work. More than 3 months of work. Years of work if you counted everything that had led to these specific maps of this specific territory. What would Meridian do with the survey data? She asked. Specifically, file land claims in advance of the official survey submission. If they have the boundary data before it's public record, they can acquire parcels at pre-survey prices, establish prior claims on the water rights position for the railroad corridor. He paused. It's not technically illegal if they acquire the data legally. And if they acquire it through me, that depends on how they acquire it. He was very still. Nora, what do you know about your uncle's arrangement with Meridian? She told him about the folder. All of it the same way she'd told him about Edmund Carr, directly without softening it. She watched his face as she talked. He listened the way he always listened, with complete attention and no performance of reaction. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You've known since before you arrived, he said. Since the night before I left. And you came anyway. I came anyway. She met his eyes. I didn't know what I was going to do about it. I still don't know exactly. But I knew I wasn't going to help him. Eli looked at the maps. He's going to ask you directly tonight. Yes. And when you refuse, he'll find another angle. She thought about the 2 company men, the timeline, the urgency she'd read in the disruption of his Thursday. He's not someone who accepts no without escalation, eh? Eli was quiet for a long time. Outside, she could hear the station yard going about its late afternoon business horses, the forge voices, the ordinary texture of a day proceeding as it should. We eat dinner, he said finally. We listen to what he says. We don't tell him what we know. He looked at her. And tomorrow I want to look at something in the Bureau filings that I've been sitting on for 2 weeks. What kind of something? The kind that might make Hector's position considerably less comfortable than he thinks it is. He picked up his pen. Go make sure May doesn't put him next to Dade at dinner. Dade has no patience for men in expensive coats. Dinner was informative in the way that performances were informative, not for what was said, but for the structure of the saying. Hector was charming, which he always was in company, and the charm was of a particular vintage that worked well on people who hadn't been exposed to it long enough to recognize its components. May was polite and watchful. Dade was at the far end of the table, as arranged, and confined himself to monosyllables and a look of sustained skepticism. Pete and Aldous were cordial in the way of men who were reserving judgment. Clara and John Whitehorse, who occasionally joined the station dinners, were not there that evening. The company men whose names were Garrett and Fitch ate, and said very little, and watched everything. Hector told 3 stories about St. Louis business affairs and asked Eli 4 questions about Wyoming land development. Each question positioned a little closer to the specific thing he wanted than the last one. The way you circle a target from increasing proximity, hoping the target doesn't notice the geometry. Eli answered each question accurately and said nothing that could be used. Afterward, when the table was clearing, Hector took Nora's arm and walked her to the far end of the porch. "He's a careful man," he said quietly. "I respect that." "He's a thorough man," Nora said. "There's a difference." "Indeed." Hector looked out at the dark valley. "Nora, I need you to understand something. What I've arranged with Meridian is its business. This territory is going to be developed regardless of what any individual does. The railroad comes through whether Crane files his surveys or not, whether Meridian has advanced data or not. The only question is who benefits. And you want to be among the people who benefit. I want you to be among them. You have nothing, Nora. Your father left you nothing. I've spent 3 years managing the estate's debts, while you—" He paused, recalibrating. "While you found your footing. This arrangement with Meridian is enough to set you up properly. Whatever happens with Crane, whether you stay here or not, you'd have resources. Independence." She listened to this. She found it interesting the way he'd framed it as being for her, the way he'd positioned her poverty as his sacrifice, rather than the condition his own management had maintained. She noted the absence of any acknowledgement that she'd been useful to his household for 3 years. She noted the warmth in his voice, genuine enough in its way. The warmth of a man who believed his own narrative. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" she said. "The Upper Valley survey, the one Crane has been working on since the flood. The Bureau needs it by end of June. If you could share the current state of the maps, the boundary data, the water rights notation, before he submits. You want me to copy Eli's survey maps and give them to Meridian. I want you to ensure your future, Nora." She was quiet for a moment. "I'll think about it," she said. He patted her arm. "Good girl." She watched him go back inside. She stood on the porch in the cold and listened to the pines and thought about what it meant that the worst he could imagine of her was still someone who needed 3 years of careful management before she'd do what she was told. She went inside and washed the dishes and went to bed. In the morning, she told Eli exactly what Hector had asked. The Bureau filing that Eli had been sitting on for 2 weeks was a discrepancy. He spread the papers on the drafting table and walked her through it. 2 sets of survey records from adjacent territory, one filed 18 months ago by a Meridian contractor, one filed 8 months ago as a correction by a federal surveyor. The difference between them was not large in absolute terms, a boundary adjustment of less than a mile in a remote section of the territory. But the adjustment moved a specific water source from one land parcel designation to another, and the Meridian contractor's original filing had positioned that water source inside a parcel that Meridian had subsequently acquired at pre-survey prices. They moved the boundary line, Nora said, in the original filing. The federal correction superseded it, but by then the land acquisition was complete. He pointed to a notation at the bottom of the Meridian contractor's survey. This surveyor's license number. I've seen it before." He pulled another paper from the stack, a license registry from the Bureau. He ran his finger down it and stopped. The name attached to the license number was not Meridian's contractor. It was a name she recognized from Hector's correspondence, one of the two men currently sleeping in the station guest room. "Garrett," she said. "Garrett." Eli looked at her. "Which means Meridian doesn't just buy survey data. They have someone who can produce survey data, or alter it." Nora looked at the papers for a long time. She thought about the boundary line adjusted less than a mile, about a water source that moved from one parcel to another on paper while remaining physically stationary in the earth, about the land acquired at pre-survey prices, about how many times this had happened in how many territories before anyone noticed the geometry of it. "If I take this to the Bureau," she said, "they open an investigation. Meridian's existing claims in this territory are reviewed. Hector's involvement becomes part of the record." "Yes." "And Garrett and Fitch are still on the property." "Also, yes." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not going to ask you to do this, Nora. I want to be clear about that. This is your family. The consequences for your uncle." "My uncle sent me here as a tool," she said. "He planned this before I arrived, and he didn't tell me, and he has spent the last 2 days trying to use what I feel for this place to make me complicit in something I'd have refused if he had asked me honestly." She paused. "He's not my family. He's someone I'm related to. That's different." Eli was quiet. "There's something else," she said. She'd been turning it over since the previous night, since Hector's voice on the porch, since the particular shape of his request. "Edmund Carr. The case 3 years ago, the land dispute my father was involved in." She looked at the boundary discrepancy on the table. What if it wasn't just my father's creditor? What if it was connected to this, to Meridian, or something like it? Eli looked at the papers. "I don't know, but it's worth finding out." She nodded slowly. The weight of it was familiar. She'd been carrying something like it for 3 years. But it felt different now, less like a burden she deserved, and more like a problem with a solution she hadn't found yet. "Where's the nearest Bureau office?" she asked. "Cheyenne, 3 days south." "How long would you need to compile everything?" "The discrepancy, your survey records." "The contractor license, 2 days." "Then we have a timing problem." She looked toward the window, toward the guest quarters, where Garrett and Fitch were sleeping. "He asked me last night. I told him I'd think about it. He won't wait more than another day before he escalates." "What does escalation look like?" She thought about Hector, about the studied patience of him, the warmth that was assembled from components, about the letters in the folder, the way he wrote about her, the word asset. "He'll go around me," she said, "directly to you, or to the Bureau, something that positions him as a concerned party rather than an interested one. He's good at that. He spent 3 years managing my father's reputation while quietly dismantling my father's business." Eli was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Go talk to May." "What?" "May has been running a trading post in a remote territory for 22 years. She has seen every variety of man who passes through this country, and she has managed all of them." He started organizing the papers into a stack. "Tell her what's happening. She'll know what Hector will do before he does it." Nora looked at him. "You trust her that much?" "I trust her more than I trust most institutions." He paused. "Also, she's going to find out regardless. Better she find out from you," said. May listened without interrupting, which was unusual for May. When Nora finished, May poured 2 cups of coffee, set one in front of Nora, and stood at the window looking out at the yard for a long moment. "The one called Fitch," she said. "He was watching the workroom window this morning." "I saw that too. And your uncle, he's the kind of man who has a contingency. He'll have thought about what happens if you refuse." She turned from the window. "What does he have on you?" Nora not guessing. "What does he actually have?" Nora set down her coffee. 3 years ago, I gave false testimony in a land dispute case. My uncle knows about it. He didn't arrange it, that was my father's creditor, but he knows. May's expression didn't change. And he'd use it. If he thought it would work. Would it? Nora thought about this carefully. About the Bureau investigation that an accusation would trigger, about the survey work and Eli's license, and the complication of associating him with someone who'd committed perjury. About Hector's talent for making clean narrative out of messy fact. It might delay things, she said, long enough for Meridian to file. May drank her coffee. Then you need to move faster than delay allows. She set down the cup. You said you know where this carman is. Last I knew, a town called Millhaven on the Nebraska border. How far? 4 days south and east, off the direct route to Cheyenne. May looked at her. You know what you need to do. Yes. And you know what it costs. Yes. Nora looked at her hands, the calloused palms from 3 months of riding and fencing and rifle practice, the ink stains from the survey work, the particular wear of hands that had been used. I've known for 3 years. I just didn't have anything worth paying it for. Troy. May was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Hector. I'll handle him today. I'll tell him you're considering his offer and need until tomorrow. That gives you enough of a head start that he can't intercept you before you reach the valley road. He'll know you helped when he figures out I've managed worse than your uncle in this trading post. May picked up both cups and took them to the wash basin. Take the roan, not juniper. The roan has better endurance. May. Go pack. She didn't turn around. And tell Eli to have those bureau papers ready. She left before dawn with the roan and a 4-day pack and the folder of bureau papers in a waterproof wrap. Eli was in the yard when she brought the horse out of the corral. He'd been there, she suspected, since before she came down. He checked the pack without commenting on its contents, tightened the cinch, checked the roan shoes, then he stood back. May knows the route to Millhaven, she asked. She drew me a map last week when I asked her about routes to the Nebraska border. He said it without inflection. I've been thinking about this for a while. She looked at him. You knew I'd have to go. I knew you'd decide to go. That's different. He paused. I knew about Carr before you told me. The arbitration contact who gave me your name mentioned the case, the real outcome. Something cold moved through her. You've known since before I wrote to your uncle, yes. His voice was steady. I knew you'd given false testimony. I knew it wasn't voluntary. I knew you'd been carrying it. He looked at her. I also knew that the person who wrote that legal summary at 19 was the same person who'd stood in a courtroom at 21 and been frightened into a wrong choice. Those aren't contradictions. They're the same person in different circumstances. She didn't say anything for a moment. You should have told me, she said. Yes. No equivocation. I was wrong not to. I told myself it wasn't my information to raise. That was true, but it was also convenient. He held her gaze. I'm sorry. She looked at the roan at the dark valley to the south, at the mountains behind the station beginning to take shape in the pre-dawn gray. When I get back, she said, when you get back. She mounted. The roan shifted and settled alert and ready, the particular aliveness of a horse that understood it was going somewhere. The answer is still yes, she said. In case you were wondering. She didn't look back to see his expression, but she heard him exhale a sound that was quiet and complete, like a map being updated, like a truth settling into its proper place. She rode south into the dark. Millhaven was a town that had had ambitions once and was managing their absence with moderate dignity. 2 streets, a mill that still operated a church, a general store, a boarding house. The kind of place that existed because someone had needed it to exist at a specific moment in the territory's history and hadn't quite gotten around to leaving when that moment passed. She found Edmund Carr through the boarding house keeper, who said there was a man by that name who helped with the mill 3 days a week and lived in the small house at the end of the 2nd Street. She stood at his door for a long time before she knocked. He was older than she remembered. Not dramatically, 4 years was not a long time, but the kind of older that came from difficulty rather than time. Thinner. Gray at the temples that hadn't been there in the courtroom. He looked at her, and she watched the recognition move across his face like weather. He didn't speak. "Mr. Carr," she said, "my name is Nora Voss. You may not— I remember you." His voice was flat and careful. "May I come in?" A long pause. Then he stepped back from the door. The house was small and orderly, the particular order of someone who'd learned to be careful with the things they had left. A table with 2 chairs, a shelf of books, a window that looked out onto the mill yard. He poured water from a pitcher without asking if she wanted it and set the cup on the table. She sat. He sat across from her, hands flat on the table, and waited. She told him, all of it the same way she'd told Eli, the same way she'd told herself in the years she'd been turning it over. The creditor, the threat, the courtroom, the words she'd said that weren't true. What had happened after, where she was now, and why she'd come. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "You came to ask me to testify," he said. "I came to tell you the truth. The testifying, that's your choice. I'm not here to ask you for anything except to hear what I should have said 4 years ago." She paused. "I'm sorry, that's not sufficient. I know it's not sufficient, but it's what I have." Edmund Carr looked at his hands. They were a working man's hands. She noticed calloused in the way of someone who'd built something physical after losing something that hadn't been physical at all. "What did you lose?" he asked quietly. "In that courtroom, for you." She thought about it honestly. "I lost the right to trust my own judgment," she said. "The right to believe I was someone who stood up for what was right. I've been smaller since then, more careful, less willing to take up space." He was quiet again. "I lost a business I'd spent 12 years building," he said. "My partner, my house." He paused. "My wife left, not immediately, but she left." He looked up. "I didn't come to Millhaven by choice. I came because it was far enough that I didn't have to explain myself to anyone who'd known me before." She absorbed this. Let it be what it was. "I know," she said. "I can't give it back. I can tell the truth now. I can tell the Bureau what happened in that case, how the testimony was obtained. It won't restore what you lost, but it might matter for what comes next." He was quiet for a very long time. She didn't fill the silence. "The man who arranged it," he said finally. "The creditor, is he still in? He died 2 years ago. His connections to Meridian Railway are still active." She slid the Bureau papers across the table. The same pattern, different territory. He looked at the papers without touching them. "If I testify," he said, "it reopens the original case. My name is in those records again. Yes, everything I've built here, this distance." "I know." She didn't soften it. "I can't tell you it's worth it. That's yours to decide. I'm only telling you that I'm going to tell the truth regardless. You deserve to know that before it happens, rather than after." He looked at the papers for a long time. Then he picked them up. They rode to Cheyenne together. Edmund Carr was not a man who did things halfway, which she suspected was a quality that had served him well before the courtroom and had not abandoned him after it. He packed a single bag arranged for someone to cover his mill days and was at her door at first light the morning after she'd knocked on his. He didn't say much on the road. Neither did she. They were both, she thought, people who understood that some preparations happened in silence and were not improved by talk. On the second night, they stopped at a way station and ate at a communal table with 3 other travelers. A land agent heading south, a woman visiting her sister in Laramie, a taciturn man who said nothing and ate with the focused efficiency of someone who had a long way to go. The land agent talked about the territory's development prospects with the cheerful obliviousness of someone who had never considered that development and displacement were the same event seen from different positions. Nora listened and said nothing. Edmund, across the table, caught her eye once. Something passed between them. Not forgiveness, not yet. Perhaps not ever, in any clean, complete form, but a kind of mutual recognition. Two people who understood what it cost when the machinery of commerce moved through a life. On the third morning, she woke before dawn and sat outside the way station in the cold and thought about Eli. She thought about him at the drafting table, pen in hand, the particular quality of his attention when he was working. She thought about the notebook margin N. Voss present. First flood. Handled it better than the horses. She thought about the compass in her pack, its needle always settling north, regardless of how much the terrain complicated the journey. She thought about what he'd said. The terrain is always right. She was the terrain she thought. Not the map someone had made of her, not Hector's version, not the courtroom version, not even the version she'd been carrying for 3 years. The terrain was what it was underneath all of those, the actual rock and water and altitude existing prior to any notation. She was going to Cheyenne to submit herself as evidence, to say in front of the Bureau and whoever else needed to hear it here, is what I did here, is what was done to me here, is what I know about the machinery. She was not doing it to become a better version of herself, or to earn anything, or to resolve anything into a clean conclusion. She was doing it because Edmund Carr deserved the truth, and because Eli's survey maps deserved to be filed without interference. And because somewhere in a stone cache on a rock shelf above a flood basin, she'd understood that updating the map was not a punishment for being wrong. It was just what you did when the terrain required it. She went back inside and ate breakfast and got on the roan. The Bureau office in Cheyenne occupied the second floor of a federal building that smelled of new lumber and old ambition. The clerk at the front desk looked at them with the particular expression of a man who had seen many people arrive with folders of papers and had developed a refined ability to assess at 10 paces whether those papers were going to create more or less work for him. He assessed them as more work. He was correct. The regional commissioner was a man named Aldrich, late 50s. Careful, the kind of official who had survived the particular politics of federal land management long enough to understand that almost everything that arrived on his desk was more complicated than it appeared. He listened to Nora for 40 minutes without interrupting. Then he looked at the papers. He looked at Edmund Carr. He looked at the contractor license number, at the boundary discrepancy, at the meridian filing records laid against Eli's survey data. Then he called in 2 assistants and told the clerk outside to hold everything else. "Miss Voss," he said, "I'm going to need a formal written statement for the original case and for the current matter. I know. It will be part of the official record. Your name, the original testimony, the circumstances. I understand." He looked at her for a moment. It will be uncomfortable. There are people connected to Meridian who have relationships with this office. Not corrupt relationships, but relationships. They will not be pleased. I expect not. Why are you doing this? She thought about how to answer that. Several versions came to her, the principled version, the legal version, the version that would satisfy an official who needed to understand motivations in order to assign appropriate weight to testimony. She said the true one. Because a man who built something real lost it to a lie I told, and because someone I trust has spent years building something real that's about to be damaged by the same machinery, and because I'm tired of being the person who knew the truth and said nothing. Aldrich looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his pen. "Let's start with the original case," he said. She wrote for 3 hours. Edmund wrote for 2. When they were done, Aldrich had 4 pages from her, and 3 from Edmund, and the Bureau papers in a separate folder that had been flagged for immediate review. He had Garrett and Fitch's contractor information and the discrepancy documentation and a clear line of evidence connecting Meridian's Wyoming land acquisitions to survey data that had been adjusted, or acquired in advance of official filing. He also had Nora's full account of Hector Voss's role, the correspondence she'd memorized from his desk, the explicit request he'd made on the station porch, the timeline she'd reconstructed from what she knew about Meridian's acquisition schedule. It was not a complete case. Aldrich was clear about that. There were gaps, there were connections that required verification. There were legal questions about jurisdiction and evidence standards that would take months to resolve. But it was enough to open a formal investigation, enough to suspend Meridian's pending Wyoming land claims, pending review, enough to flag Hector's name in a way that would follow him through every federal land transaction for the foreseeable future. The original case, Aldrich said, looking at Edmund's statement, the arbitration outcome. We can petition to have it reviewed in light of new evidence. I know, Edmund said. He had a particular stillness now that he hadn't had when she'd first found him at his door, not the stillness of someone waiting for something to happen, but the stillness of someone who had done what needed doing and was letting it settle. It won't restore everything, eh? I know that, too. Edmund looked at the window. It's enough that the record says what actually happened. Aldrich nodded. He looked at Nora. There may be consequences for you. The original testimony, even under duress, even with the circumstances you've described, I understand. You should speak with a lawyer before we proceed further. I have a working knowledge of land law and contract structure, she said. I'll manage. Something crossed his expression that might, in a different kind of man, have been the beginning of a smile. Yes, he said, I expect you will. She sent a wire to the station from the Cheyenne telegraph office. Matters proceeding, back in 6 days. The Bureau has the paper, N.V. She stood at the counter after she sent it and thought about what was happening at the station right now, whether Hector was still there, whether May had managed to hold the timeline, whether Eli was at the drafting table or on the ridge, or somewhere in the high country adjusting a measurement. She thought about what he'd said the morning she left. The answer is still yes. The way she'd said it, not as a declaration, but as a statement of fact, the way you'd say the water is cold or the ridge runs northeast. Because it was true, and true things should be said. Edmund was at the counter beside her, sending his own wire to someone in Nebraska she gathered from the address. She didn't ask who. Some things were not her territory. When he came back, he stood beside her for a moment, both of them looking at the street outside the bustle of Cheyenne wagons and horses and the particular noise of a city that was still deciding what it was going to be. The man you're going back to, Edmund said, the surveyor. Yes, he knows what you did. He knew before I did. Edmund was quiet for a moment. That's either very good or very strange. Both wish, she said, mostly good. He looked at the street. I'm not going back to Millhaven. She turned to look at him. Too small, he said simply. Too much distance built in. I've been maintaining distance as though it protected me from something, but the thing I was keeping distance from was already inside. He paused. I'm going to see a man in Laramie who owes me a professional conversation. See what's available. Edmund, don't apologize again. His voice was not unkind. It doesn't help either of us. What you did in that office today. He paused, choosing words with the care of someone who'd been thinking about them for a long time. I've been waiting for someone to say what actually happened. Not for me particularly, just for it to be on record somewhere, the real version. He looked at her. Thank you for that. She looked at him, at the man who'd lost a business and a partner and a house and 12 years of building something and had come out the other end of it in a small town, doing mill work and reading books and managing with moderate dignity the absence of his own ambitions. The surveyor, she said. His name is Eli Crane. If you ever need work that uses your experience land claims. Contract Review Territory Documentation. Right to Crane Station, Wyoming Territory. We'll find something." Edmund looked at her for a moment. "You haven't actually asked him if that's all right." "He'll say yes." "You're certain?" "He's the kind of man who pays fair wages and doesn't ask where you came from." She picked up her coat from the counter. "I'm certain." Edmund looked at the street. Then he nodded once with the specific quality of a man who'd been offered something he hadn't expected and was deciding to accept it on its own terms rather than the terms of everything that had come before. "Good luck to you, Miss Voss," he said. "It's Mrs. Crane," she said, nearly. She arrived back at the station on a Thursday evening, 6 days after she'd left, coming up the valley road in the last light, with the roan tired and the mountains burning orange above the ridge. May was on the trading post porch. She stood when she saw Nora coming and crossed the yard without waiting. "Well," she said, "Bureau has everything. Formal investigation opened. Meridian's Wyoming claim suspended pending review. Hector's name is in the record." May exhaled. "Oh, and you?" "I'm in the record too. The original testimony, the circumstances." She dismounted and handed the reins to the boy who'd appeared from the corral. "It's done." May looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was the closest thing to maternal Nora had seen from her not-soft May, was not soft, but something real underneath the briskness. "Hector left 2 days ago," May said, "when he realized you weren't coming back with what he wanted." "Did he say anything?" "He said quite a number of things." May's voice was dry. "Most of them I won't repeat." Dade stood in the doorway the whole time, which helped move the conversation along. She paused. "The company men left first. I think Garrett understood the situation before your uncle did. Where's Eli?" May tilted her head toward the ridge. "He was at the survey point above the North Corral, same place she'd found him that first morning theodolite, on its tripod notebook in hand, taking readings in the last light. He didn't look up when she reached the shelf, but he'd heard her coming. You always heard people coming up the ridge. The rock carried sound." She stopped beside him and looked out at the valley. The light was doing something specific and temporary, the angle of sunset on the granite faces above them, the long shadows running east across the valley floor, the way the green of the new grass went, almost gold, at this hour. She'd learned enough about this landscape in 4 months to know that this particular combination of light and angle lasted approximately 12 minutes and did not repeat identically. She thought about blue-gray snow at 6 in the morning. "Bureau investigation is open," she said. "Meridian's Wyoming claim suspended. Hector's in the record." He made a notation in the notebook. "Edmund Carr. He testified he's going to Laramie. I told him to write if he needed contract work." She paused. "You'll say yes." "Yes." No hesitation. She looked at the valley. "Garrett's a licensed surveyor. Falsified. The license registry will show it now that the investigation is open." The boundary discrepancy goes back further than Wyoming. There are 2 cases in Nebraska that may get a second look. "I know. Aldrich wired me yesterday." She turned to look at him. He was making another notation. Pen moving in the small, precise script she'd come to know as the margin script, the one that said true things rather than necessary things. "What are you writing?" she asked. He tilted the notebook so she could read. "Upper Valley Survey complete, submitted to Bureau, June 1878. N. Voss, co-author of Field Notation. The water rights are correctly designated. The boundary lines are true." She read it twice. "Co-author," she said. "You wrote half the margin notes. I didn't know they were official." "Everything I write is official. I told you that at the beginning." He capped the pen and looked at her fully the same way he had looked at her through the lamplight in the stone caches, without performance or assessment. Just looking. "Are you all right?" She thought about the honest answer. "I'm tired," she said. "I'm lighter than I was. I don't know if that's all right or something else. It doesn't feel like nothing. It's not nothing. She looked at the valley. At the light running out of it, the shadows lengthening toward darkness, the mountains going from orange to purple, to the particular dark blue they became in the last minutes before full dark. "Eli," she said. "Yes." "I want to get married before the snow." A pause. "That's August at the latest, possibly July if the summer runs cold. Then we should stop standing on ridges and start making arrangements. Old to Shamor." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him beside her, the warmth of him, the solidity, the particular quality of his presence that she'd been aware of since the flood, and had stopped pretending she wasn't aware of some time around the compass. "May is going to have opinions about the arrangements," he said. "May always has opinions. They're usually right." She almost smiled. Usually. He began folding up the theodolite. She held the notebook the way she had that first morning watching him work the valley going dark below them, and the first stars appearing above the ridgeline. Not the thin scatter of city stars, but the full weight of them, the quantity that still startled her, sometimes the sky doing its enormous indifferent work. "The name," she said. "On the map. Nora's Basin. What about it, I want to see it. The actual place on an actual filed copy. Official record. It's on the copy submitted to the Bureau this morning." He took the notebook back and tucked it under his arm. "It's in the record now. It doesn't come off." She looked at the stars. True things written down, she thought. The terrain always right. The map updated when necessary and the true version submitted to the record and kept there. She'd spent 4 years believing that the wrong thing she'd done was the most permanent thing about her. It turned out that permanence was available to other things too. Better things. Things with her initials on them and her notation in the margins and her name on a basin in the upper valley of a territory that was still in significant portions unnamed. She picked up one side of the theodolite tripod. "Come on," she said. "May will have kept dinner." They were married on the second Saturday of July, in the station yard, in the long northern light that lasted until 9 in the evening and made everything look the way things look in memory, slightly more gold than real life, slightly more permanent. May organized it with the focused efficiency she brought to everything that mattered. The trading post porch was cleared and decorated with whatever the high country offered in July, wild columbine and blue and white pine boughs. The particular small yellow flowers that Clara said were called something in her grandmother's language and something else in the field guide, and something else again in the common speech of the valley, which was one of the things she liked about this place, the way the same thing could have 3 true names. Clara and John came with their children. Dade wore a clean shirt and his best expression, which was the expression of a man who had decided not to be skeptical about this specific thing. Pete and Aldous came down from the survey camp in the high country, sunburned and cheerful, bringing a bottle of something that Pete described as medicinal and Aldous described as necessary. Several ranchers from the valley attended people Nora had come to know through the trading post and the supply runs and the particular sociability of a place where knowing your neighbors was not optional. There was no guest from St. Louis. She had written to her mother's sister in Indiana, the one relative she'd maintained anything like warmth with through the Hector years, and received a brief, genuine reply that said she was glad Nora had found something real and that the dress she was sending by post would arrive late, but was better late than never. The dress arrived the morning of the wedding. Slightly crushed from the journey, a pale gray that her aunt said matched Nora's eyes, and that Nora thought matched the granite above the ridge, which she found more satisfying. She dressed in May's back room, while May made critical observations about her hair, and Nora made critical observations about May's critical observations, and both of them pretended this was not exactly the morning either of them would have chosen. "You're not nervous," May said. "I'm very nervous." "You don't look it." "I've had practice not looking it." She looked at herself in May's small mirror. The gray dress, the hair that May had managed into something that was simultaneously functional and not embarrassing the compass on its cord at her throat, because she'd decided it was the only piece of jewelry she owned that she'd actually chosen. May. Thank you for the 2 days when I was gone. Managing things. May met her eyes in the mirror. She said again, which from May was the equivalent of a long speech. Eli was standing at the far end of the yard when she came out talking with Pete about something survey-related that Pete was gesturing through with both hands. He looked up when she appeared at the trading post door. He went still for a moment. She walked toward him across the yard, past the assembled community of this place she'd come to knowing nothing, and had learned incrementally and imperfectly to understand. Past Dade with his clean shirt and his best expression. Past Clara's children running between the adults with the anarchic energy of children who were somewhere they were always welcome. Past the long table May had set with a combined output of 3 days of cooking. She stopped in front of Eli. "Pete," he said without looking away from her, "the triangulation can wait." Pete, to his credit, was already gone. "The dress arrived," she said. "I can see that." His voice was quiet. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at her through the lamplight in the stone cache, without performance, without assessment. Just looking. "You look like yourself." "Is that a compliment?" "It's the best one I know how to give." She looked at him for a moment. At the face she'd been studying for 4 months, learning its weather, the way she'd learned to read the sky above the granite. Not as an inventory of features, but as a landscape with its own logic, its own patterns of light and shadow, and the particular configurations that meant something was coming. "Ready?" she asked. "Since March," he said. She almost smiled. "That's presumptuous, eh? It's honest. It's both." He held out his hand, the same hand he'd held out that first day at the station, waiting without pressure, offering without requiring. She looked at it for a moment. The ink stains, the calluses, the scar on the inside of his wrist she'd never asked about, and he'd never explained, and that was simply by now one of the things she knew about him. She took it. The ceremony was short and specific and entirely true, which was, she thought, the only way to do it. Afterward, May produced the something Pete had described as medicinal, and they sat at the long table in the long northern light, and ate and talked and laughed at things that were genuinely funny, and sat in comfortable silence at things that didn't need words. Edmund Carr was not there, but Nora had written to him in Laramie, and he had written back a brief letter formal in its structure that said he'd been offered a position with a land management firm, and that the Meridian investigation had moved faster than anyone expected, and that the original arbitration case had been referred for review. He had not said anything about forgiveness, which she appreciated. He had ended the letter with, "I trust the mapping work is going well. E. Carr." She had put the letter in the waterproof wrap with the bureau papers which she kept on the shelf in the workroom between a survey manual and Eli's copy of Thoreau. At some point in the evening, Dade played the fiddle, which it turned out he could do, had always been able to do, had simply never done in her presence until now. Clara's youngest fell asleep under the table and was not moved. Pete gave a speech that was mostly about surveying and only tangentially about marriage, but was received with genuine warmth because Pete meant it. May, at the end of the evening, touched Nora's arm and said nothing, and Nora covered her hand and said nothing back, and that was enough. Real marriage began the next morning. Not the ceremony of it, the fact of it. Waking up in the same space. Negotiating the particular logistics of two people who had both spent significant time alone, and had therefore developed strong and occasionally incompatible opinions about the organization of shared spaces. She moved the field notebooks from the left side of the drafting table to the right side, where they were more efficiently organized by survey section rather than by date. He moved them back. She moved them again with a note explaining the organizational logic. He read the note, acknowledged the logic, and kept his own system. She decided this was a battle she would return to. They established in the first 2 weeks the following facts about living with each other. Eli could not be spoken to before his first cup of coffee. A limitation he'd mentioned, but that she had not fully credited until she observed it in practice. Nora needed a specific period of quiet in the evenings to think through the day, which Eli had apparently already intuited because he'd been providing it without being asked. Eli left doors open. Nora closed them. This created a cycle that they managed with moderate grace. They also established the work ran better with 2 people than with 1. She had an eye for the legal and contractual implications of survey notation that he acknowledged was better than his. He had a spatial intelligence about terrain that she was developing but hadn't matched yet. Together they could look at a map section and the field notes and produce a documentation that was both technically precise and legally defensible, which the bureau contact in Cheyenne said was the most useful combination he'd encountered in the territory. They were, in other words, partners. Not the romantic abstraction of it, but the actual functional thing. 2 people who had different strengths and acknowledged the difference and built something from it that neither could have built alone. They were also, which she hadn't fully anticipated, something else. Something that had been developing since the stone cache, and the lamplight, and the peaches, and that expressed itself in the ordinary moments of a shared life in ways she hadn't had language for before, and was developing language for now. In the way he brought her coffee without being asked, because he'd noticed she wanted it. In the way she knew before he came in from the ridge what he'd found up there by the specific character of his footsteps on the porch. In the way they argued about the notebooks and the doors and the organizational systems and reached through the arguing. An understanding that the arguing itself was a form of trust that you only bothered to fight for your position with someone who was worth fighting with. She thought about what he'd said that first night. I didn't want willing. I wanted someone for whom this was already the shape of their thinking. She thought she understood it better now than she had then. The shape of her thinking had always been this, the precise, the true, the useful, the willing to stand in a difficult place and look at it clearly rather than look away. She'd spent 4 years trying to make herself smaller than that shape because she'd done something wrong and believed that the wrongness made the shape invalid. It didn't. She was, in fact, exactly who she'd always been. She was just finally somewhere that needed exactly that. The first real fight came 3 weeks into married life and was about the field notebook organizational system, which escalated as their arguments tended to do into something larger. The larger thing in this case was decision-making authority on the survey work, specifically who had final say on the notation style for the Bureau submissions, which was a question that mattered because the Bureau was in the process of developing standardized notation guidelines, and whoever submitted the most coherent system first would have influence on what those guidelines became. It was, in other words, not actually about the notebooks. She slept in the workroom that night, which was uncomfortable because the workroom had no bed, only a cot that Aldous used when he was down from the high country. She lay on the cot, looking at the survey maps on the wall and being annoyed about the notation system and also about the cot. In the morning, Eli knocked on the workroom door. "I'm still annoyed," she said. "I know, so am I." His voice through the door was the voice of someone who had also spent an uncomfortable night reconsidering. "Can I come in?" "Yes." He came in and sat on the edge of the drafting table. They looked at each other with the mutual recognition of 2 stubborn people who had each spent the night privately concluding that the other person had at least one valid point. "We need rules," he said, "for how we fight, because we're both going to have opinions and we're both going to believe we're right, and we're going to do this again." The notation system. "I know, you're right about the Bureau guidelines. I'm right about the field efficiency." He paused, which means we need a third system that takes both into account. She looked at him. "You want to design a compromise notation system at 7 in the morning. I want to not sleep on my side of the bed alone because we couldn't figure out how to fight productively." He held her gaze. "We're partners, Nora. That means we fight like partners. We don't go to bed with it unresolved. We don't let it sit and harden. We say the real thing, even if the real thing is that we both want to be right." She thought about this. "You want to be right," she said. "Almost always. So do I. I know. It's one of the things I specifically wanted in a partner." She looked at the maps on the wall. At the Upper Valley section, its boundary lines correctly designated the water rights, accurately notated her name in the margin co-authoring the field notation. "Third system," she said. "Third system. We present it to the Bureau as a joint submission." He was quiet for a moment. "Both names. Both names." He nodded. "All right." She stood up from the cot and straightened her skirt. "The cot is terrible." "I know. Aldous has complained about it for 2 years. He held the workroom door open. Coffee. Coffee," she agreed. They went out to the main room together, and the morning proceeded with the ordinary useful business of a life being built. And if neither of them mentioned the fight again, it was not because they'd forgotten it, but because they'd said the real thing, and the real thing had been enough. The letter from Laramie arrived in October, carried up the valley road with the weekly supply wagon tucked between a bureau correspondence and a seed catalog May had ordered 3 months ago and had stopped expecting. Nora was at the drafting table when May brought it in. She recognized the handwriting on the envelope, the careful, slightly formal script of a man who had learned to write in an era when penmanship was considered a moral quality, and who had kept the habit even when the era hadn't. She set down her pen. "From Carr?" Eli asked without looking up from his own work. "Yes." She opened it. The letter was 2 pages, which was longer than his previous correspondence. Edmund Carr was not a man who wrote 2 pages without reason. She read it once quickly, and then again slowly. The first page was businesslike. He had taken the position with the land management firm. The work was substantive, contract review, claim documentation, the kind of detailed territorial legal work that required someone who understood both the law and the land and the space between them where most of the real decisions happened. He wrote useful again. He had not written that word with drama. He had written it the way you wrote a fact that had been missing from the record for a while and had now been reinstated. The Meridian investigation had moved further than anyone had expected. 4 cases had been referred for review, 2 in Wyoming, 1 in Nebraska, 1 in Colorado. The boundary discrepancy documentation had turned out to be the thread that, when pulled, revealed a pattern going back nearly a decade. Garrett had cooperated with investigators in exchange for reduced charges, which had accelerated the timeline considerably. Hector's name appeared in 3 of the 4 cases in a capacity that the investigators described in the careful language of federal inquiry as consistent with foreknowledge of survey data prior to official publication. She read that twice. The second page was different in tone, less formal, the kind of writing that came from someone who had been composing sentences in their head for a long time and had finally decided to put them on paper. "I have been thinking," he wrote, "about what you said in Cheyenne, that you came not to ask anything of me, but to tell me the truth. I want you to know that I understood the difference at the time, even if I didn't say so. I've spent 4 years being careful about what I trusted, which was the correct response to what happened, but became over time a habit rather than a judgment. You did something when you came to my door that I hadn't done. You traded safety for truth. I've been thinking about what that costs and what it opens. I am not writing to tell you I've stopped being angry. I'm not certain I have, and I don't think false resolution serves either of us. I am writing to tell you that I understand why you did what you did in that courtroom, and I understand what it took to do what you did in Cheyenne. And I think those 2 things together describe a person more accurately than either one alone. I am also writing because you offered me work, and I find that I may take you up on it. The land management firm is good work. But there is a survey documentation project in the northern Wyoming Territory that requires someone with experience in both legal notation and fieldwork, and my employer has asked if I know anyone with that combination. I told him I might, if the offer still stands. Write to me at the address below, Icar. P.S. I am told Nora's Basin is in the filed survey record. I looked it up. It's a good name for a place. She sat with the letter for a long time. Outside, the October wind was doing its specific work on the pines, the sound that had frightened her a little on her first night, and that she'd stopped hearing as frightening sometime around the flood, sometime around the moment she'd started hearing it as simply the sound of the place she lived. It was a colder wind now than it had been in July. The high country had already had its first light snow, and the days were shortening with the particular efficiency of northern autumn, the light going low and gold earlier each afternoon. She thought about the man who'd sat across from her in Millhaven with his hands flat on the table, and his careful stillness, and 4 years of managed distance in his face. She thought about the man who'd written 2 pages to Wyoming about being useful again, and false resolution, and a survey documentation project. She thought about the basin in the upper valley. The actual place, the rock and water and altitude of it existing long before anyone had arrived with an instrument to measure it, and a pen to write its name. She stood up and went to the door of the workroom. Eli was at the theodolite bench calibrating an instrument that had come back from the high country. Audrey, slightly out of true. He looked up. She handed him the letter. He read it without speaking. She watched his face do the thing it did when he was processing something that required care, the particular stillness, the attention that wasn't performance. When he finished, he set the letter on the bench. "The survey documentation project," he said. "I know what it is. The northern section, the one you've been saying, needs someone with legal notation experience for 6 months. I haven't formally proposed it to the Bureau yet. Propose it." He looked at the letter. He'd be working with us, not for us. That distinction matters. I know it matters. That's why I'm asking. He was quiet for a moment. "It'll take him 3 months to finish the Laramie contract. That puts him here in January at the earliest. Deep winter. He survived 4 years in Millhaven. He can survive January in Wyoming." Eli picked up the letter again and read the postscript. Something moved across his face, small and genuine, and quickly gone. The expression she'd learned meant he was pleased about something he hadn't expected to be pleased about. "Nora's Basin," he said. He looked it up. Of course he did. He set the letter down and went back to the theodolite. Write to him, tell him the offer stands. She went back to the drafting table and picked up her pen. She wrote to Edmund Carr. She told him the offer stood. She told him the northern section documentation would begin in spring, and that if he arrived by February there would be time to review the existing survey work before the melt season made field work possible. She told him the notation system they developed for the Bureau submissions, the joint system. The third system would require some learning, but that the logic of it was sound. She told him that Nora's Basin was approximately 6 miles north-northeast of the station, accessible by a track that became unreliable in heavy snow, and that the basin itself was larger than its name suggested, and held water from 3 separate sources, which made the naming of the water rights the most legally complex section of the Upper Valley Survey, and that she expected he would find it interesting. She signed it Nora Crane, Crane Station, Wyoming Territory. She looked at the name for a moment. Then she folded the letter and set it with the outgoing correspondence and went back to the survey section she'd been working on. Winter came hard that year, which May said was typical of years that had been too easy in the fall. The first real snow fell in November. Not the light exploratory snow of October, but the full commitment of a northern winter, 3 days of it steady and dense, until the valley was white to the ridgelines, and the station was an island of warmth and smoke in a sea of still white. Nora had been told about Wyoming winters. She had not been told in a way that had adequately communicated the scale of them. The scale, it turned out, was less about the cold, though the cold was serious, reaching temperatures. She had no previous reference point for the kind of cold that made iron painful to touch and turned breath into visible testimony, and more about the comprehensiveness of it. Winter here did not permit partial attention. It required the full focus of everyone on the property all day. Every day, the continuous work of keeping things alive in conditions designed to end things. She learned to read the sky for incoming weather with the same attention she'd given to legal documents looking for the specific combination of cloud formation and wind direction and temperature drop. That meant you had 2 hours to bring in the livestock before it became impossible to bring in anything. She learned the difference between the cold that was simply cold and the cold that could kill you if you made a wrong decision about how far from the station to range and how quickly. She learned that Dade's Forge, which she'd thought of as primarily a utilitarian facility, was in winter a social institution, the one space on the property that was reliably warm enough to gather in without burning fuel that was needed elsewhere. And that people came to it in the evenings, not primarily for the heat, but for the company and the specific human maintenance that came from being in the same room with people you trusted when the world outside was actively hostile. She learned that May, who she thought she understood, was in winter a different and larger version of herself, the central intelligence of the station's survival, managing food stores and fuel supply and the complex arithmetic of who needed what, when, and in what quantity. Doing it with the focused precision of someone who had done it many times before and knew exactly how much margin there was and how little. She helped. She was useful in specific ways, the accounts, the supply calculations, the legal paperwork. That winter gave her time to work through more thoroughly than the survey season allowed. She was also useful in ways she hadn't anticipated. The evenings in Dade's Forge, when someone's child had a fever and the nearest doctor was genuinely 3 days away on the far side of weather that made 3 days a theoretical distance, she sat with the child and read stories she invented because the station's book collection didn't extend to children's literature, and the stories were imperfect, and sometimes took turns she hadn't planned. And the children didn't care, and neither did she. She thought about May's observation in the trading post, "That's not a woman made for somewhere else." She thought she understood it now in a way she hadn't when May said it. Not as a compliment or a prescription, but as a simple topographic fact. Some terrain matched some people. The matching wasn't comfortable necessarily. The terrain didn't adjust itself for comfort, and neither did she. But it was real. It was a fit between two things that were both fundamentally what they were. In December, a blizzard came. Not the storms she'd encountered in November. Those had been significant. This was different in the way that the difference between a difficult conversation and a crisis was different. The sky went white in under an hour. The wind built to a sound she had no category for. A continuous roar that made the station walls do something she'd never experienced buildings doing before, a kind of low vibration that she felt in her chest rather than heard with her ears. They lost the ability to move between buildings by midday. Eli had rigged guide ropes between the main structures in October. At her request, she'd read about the practice in a Western settlement manual and had asked him to do it with the specific practicality of someone who was already thinking about what winter would require. The ropes were essential now. You could not see past the end of your arm in the open. The guide ropes were the difference between finding the stable and not finding the stable. She spent the first day of the blizzard moving between the main house, the stable, and Dade's Forge with May's supply inventory. In her head, redistributing food and fuel and checking on animals and people with the efficiency of someone who understood that panic was not a useful response to conditions that required only clear thinking and physical effort. Eli was everywhere she wasn't. They passed each other in doorways and communicated in the shorthand that had developed over 6 months of working together. A look, a nod, a few words that contained more information than they appeared to, because both of them had the context to read them correctly. On the second night, she found him in the stable, finishing the last check on the horses. She sat down on a hay bale, and he sat beside her, and they were both too tired to talk for a long time and didn't bother trying. Outside, the blizzard was doing its enormous impersonal work on everything. "The Henderson family in Red Creek," she said finally. "They're all right. James rode out this morning before it peaked. They're sheltering with the white horses." He paused. "Everyone's accounted for." "Deeds?" "Good." She leaned her head back against the stable wall. The horses moved in their stalls, warm and unhurried, the sound of them like slow breathing. "Eli." "I've been thinking about the documentation project for the spring. If Edmund is here by February, we could start the preliminary legal review before the melt, identify the claim boundaries that need field verification before we can submit." He was quiet for a moment. "We're in a blizzard." "I know, I'm thinking about spring." A pause. She felt him shake slightly beside her. Not cold, she thought, but the suppressed quality of something that wanted to become a sound. "What?" she said. "Nothing." He was definitely suppressing something. "Eli, He stopped. "I brought you up a mountain in March of last year to marry a stranger, and you're sitting in a blizzard in December planning the spring survey calendar." "The spring calendar needs planning." "Ton." "I know it does." The suppressed thing surfaced not quite a laugh, but the quality of something warm and genuine and slightly helpless. Yes. The preliminary legal review. We can start in February." She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the horses, and in the stable lantern light, his face had the particular expression she'd catalogued as pleased about something he hadn't expected to be pleased about, present in a way that he was not always present, something uncalculated. She thought about the theodolite on the ridge, about blue-gray snow at 6 in the morning, about the pen moving in the margin to record things that were true, rather than necessary. She thought about a man who had spent years believing he was a person. People left who had built guide ropes between buildings in October because someone he trusted had read about a useful practice and asked him to. "Eli," she said. "Yes, the blizzard is going to break tomorrow. The pressure changed this afternoon." He looked up at the stable roof, which was doing its own creaking commentary on the conditions. "Probably. When it breaks, I want to go up to the ridge. Take the first readings." He looked at her. "The snow will be deep. I know." "It'll be difficult going." "I know that too." A silence, and in it the blizzard, and under the blizzard the horses. And under the horses the sense she'd been developing for months of being in exactly the right place, for exactly the wrong reasons that had turned out incrementally and irreversibly to be the right ones. "All right," he said, "we go up when it breaks." The blizzard broke on the third morning as she'd predicted. They went up the ridge in snow that came to the knee in places, using the guide ropes where they existed and their own judgment where they didn't, and arrived at the survey shelf in the clean, cold silence that followed major weather, the particular stillness of a landscape that had just finished doing something enormous and was resting. The valley below was white and unbroken. The mountains above were white and sharp against a sky that had gone a blue so absolute it looked manufactured. The survey point was buried to the theodolite base, which Eli dug out with the efficiency of someone who had done this before. While he set up the instrument, Nora looked out at the valley. She was thinking about the letter in her coat pocket. Edmund's letter, which she'd been carrying since October, the way she'd once carried the list she'd made the night she went through Hector's desk, the way she'd once carried the wrong thing she'd done. Not as a weight now. As a fact, one of many facts about the landscape of her own life, true and placed and integrated into the larger picture. She thought about what he'd written. "I'd traded safety for truth. I've been thinking about what that costs and what it opens." What it had cost was the version of herself that moved carefully through spaces that didn't belong to her, making herself small enough not to be noticed and useful enough not to be discarded. What it had opened was this. The ridge, the snow, the valley. the man behind her adjusting the theodolite with ink-stained hands in the cold. The work in the spring. Edmund arriving in February. The notation system with both their names on it. The survey of the northern section and the water rights of Nora's Basin, and the documentation project that would take 2 years and produce a record that would be consulted by people who would never know the names of the people who had made it, except that the names were in the margin, and the margin was official, and the margin did not come off. She heard Eli open his notebook, heard the pen uncap. "What are you writing?" she asked. First post-blizzard readings. Upper Valley Survey Point, December 1878. A pause. Wind damage to the northeast face, 2 trees down, visible from the ridge. Snow depth at Survey Point, approximately 31 inches. Another pause. The valley is very white. She turned. He was looking at her over the top of the notebook. "That last part isn't survey data," she said. "No. You're putting it in the margin. It's true." She looked at him, at the face she'd spent 9 months learning, at the expression she'd cataloged as pleased about something unexpected, which she now understood was simply what he looked like when he was happy, which was not a state he performed or announced, but simply inhabited the way he inhabited everything, with the full weight of his attention and no drama attached. She turned back to the valley. "Write something else," she said. "What? Whatever you're thinking. The true thing." A silence. The wind moved through the high pines below them, sending small cascades of snow from the upper branches. The theodolite needle swung and settled. Somewhere across the valley, a hawk was working the updraft above the southern ridge, circling with the efficient patience of something that understood how to use the conditions rather than fight them. She heard the pen moving. When he finished, she turned. He tilted the notebook so she could read. In the margin, in the small, precise script she had come to know as the one he used for things that were true rather than necessary, N. Crane present. First winter complete. She was right about the pressure. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at him. "That's all," she said. "The margin is small. You could use more than the margin." Oh, he looked at the notebook. At her. At the valley below, and the mountains above, and the long white silence of a December morning after a storm that had required everything and left everything cleaner than before. He turned to a fresh page. She watched him write. He wrote for a long time, longer than the margin, filling half the page with the small, precise script that was not the bureau script, but the other one, the one that said what was true rather than what was required. She didn't read it over his shoulder. That page was his. He would show her when he was ready, or he wouldn't. And either way, she knew what it contained, because she'd been present for the accumulation of it every day of 9 months, every survey and argument and coffee cup and blizzard and guide rope and moment of ordinary shared attention that constituted the actual fact of a life being built. When he finished, he capped the pen and closed the notebook. They stood on the ridge together in the cold morning light and looked at what they'd made. Not the survey, though the survey was real and the record was accurate and the names in the margin were permanent. Not the station, though the station was solid and the people in it were the people she'd chosen and who had chosen her back. Not any single thing, but the whole of it, the shape of a life that had been assembled from true materials, assembled under difficult conditions. Assembled by 2 people who understood that the map was not the terrain, and that the only useful response to the terrain being different from the map was to update the map. She had come to Wyoming Territory in April with a traveling bag, a folder of papers she shouldn't have read, a crime she'd been carrying for 3 years, and nothing else she could count on. She was standing on a ridge in December with her name on a basin in the upper valley, and a survey record with her notation in the margins, and a man beside her who had been looking for her specifically, who had waited 3 years to ask, who wrote true things in the margins of his field notebooks and updated his maps when the terrain required it, and had rigged guide ropes between buildings in October because she'd asked him to. She was exactly who she'd always been. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because anyone had told her so, not because the terrain had been kind, or the conditions had been easy, or the journey had been what she'd expected. Because she'd ridden up a mountain to marry a stranger with a list in her pocket and a crime in her heart, and had found incrementally and imperfectly that the shape of her thinking matched the shape of this place, the difficult and the true and the useful and the willing to stand in hard conditions and look clearly at what was there. The woman who had stood in Hector's hallway listening through oak doors and believing herself to be a problem in need of a solution had been right about one thing: something was about to change. She'd been wrong about everything else. She was not a problem. She was not a tool or an asset or a liability or a name on a list of things to manage. She was the co-author of a survey that would be in the federal record for as long as the record existed. She was the woman who had ridden to Millhaven and told the truth when the truth cost something. She was the person who'd designed the third notation system and proposed it as a joint submission and been right about the Bureau guidelines and would probably be right about the spring calendar too. She was Nora Crane of Crane Station, Wyoming Territory. Her name was on the map. And she was not going anywhere. "Come on," Eli said beside her. "The horses need checking." In a minute, she looked at the valley. At the long white of it, the mountains rising from it, the smoke from the station chimneys below, evidence of warmth, evidence of people, evidence of the continuous work of being alive in a place that required your full attention and gave back in exchange. The particular satisfaction of conditions met with competence. "What are you looking at?" he asked. "Everything we built." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said in the voice he used for true things, "We're not done yet." She looked at him sideways. "No." 5 years of survey work left in the northern section alone. "I know." "And the documentation project, and the notation guidelines, and Eli." "Yes, I know." She looked back at the valley. "I'm not going anywhere." He stood beside her, and the cold moved through the high pines, and the hawk crossed the updraft above the southern ridge, and the station below was warm and occupied and continuing, and they stood there until the light shifted, and the theodolite waited, and the spring was months away, and the work was still to be done. Then they went down.